The elder pressed her thumb into the boy's palm the morning he was born, and read the line there the way her mother had taught her and her mother's mother before that. She didn't speak for a long time. The cave was cold. Outside, the pale sun was just beginning to clear the ridge, and the light it threw was thin and gray, the color of old bone. "This one," she said finally. Nobody cheered. They never cheered. You didn't cheer a sentence. His name was Soren, and he was given 8 days. That was the rule of the world now. 8 days from first breath to last. The span of a full human life compressed into something you could hold in your 2 hands. No one remembered when it had started. The oldest among them, a man named Kale, who had reached his 7th day, and moved with the slow deliberation of someone carrying too much, said it had always been this way. His bones said otherwise. His bones said something had gone wrong a long time ago, and nobody had fixed it, and everyone had eventually stopped asking why. What they did instead was train. The training began the morning of the first day. The elders brought their puzzles and their games, flat boards inlaid with geometric shapes, sliding locks, weighted spheres that had to be balanced through mazes of carved stone. The boy Soren was strapped to his learning board before he could walk. He was given the sliding lock when his hands were still soft. He worked it with his gums at first, experimentally, tasting the metal, and then with his once the fingers learned what fingers were for. The elders watched him with their weathered, tired faces, and took notes on clay tablets in a script so old no one could fully read it anymore. None of the elders could tell you what the puzzles were for. That was the truth, no one said aloud. The training had been passed down so many generations that its purpose had become mythological. A story told around fires about a door at the far end of the valley, past the dead fields and the broken towers and the 3 trials the ancestors had laid there. Open the door, the story said, and the sun would come back properly, the gray would lift, the 8 days would end. People would live real lives again, long ones, lives with weight and memory and room for love that didn't have to be compressed into hours. Soren did not ask questions. He worked the puzzles. He slept when they let him sleep, and woke when they pulled him upright. And in the thin gray mornings, before the lesson started, he would sit at the cave mouth and stare out at the valley and think about nothing in particular. He had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness. His mother had died on her 8th day, as everyone did. His father had died on his 7th after walking out into the cold looking for kindling and not coming back. Neither of these things made Soren special. They made him ordinary, which was the only currency that mattered here. What made him special was the line on his palm. On the morning of his 3rd day, he could solve the sliding lock in 11 seconds. On the morning of his 4th day, he could balance the weighted sphere through the full stone maze without it touching a wall. The elders watched him and said nothing, wrote in their tablets, and at night the boy lay in the dark and listened to the wind move through the valley and tried to imagine what it would feel like to live long enough to know a season. He had never seen rain. He had seen descriptions of it, painted on the cave walls in pigments made from crushed stone. It looked, in those paintings, like something between music and grief. On the 5th day, the elder who had read his palm came to him before the others arrived. Her name was Maren. She had deep-set eyes and hands that shook slightly now, the tremor that came with the 7th day, and she sat across from him in the gray pre-dawn and looked at him a long time before she spoke. "You know what I'm going to ask you," she said. "Yes. You don't have to say yes." He looked at his hands. He had his mother's eyes, dark and careful, and he turned them on Maren now, with something that wasn't quite resignation and wasn't quite courage, just the thing underneath both of those. The plain fact of himself. "I know," he said. She handed him a water skin, a blade worn thin from long use, and a folded piece of cloth that had once been a map and was now mostly a suggestion. In the gray light, she put her hands on either side of his face the way mothers did, and held him there a moment, looking. "The trials will be exactly what you trained for," she said, "even if they don't look like it." He left at first light. The valley was wider than it looked from the cave mouth. The dead fields stretched out under that pale sky. The soil the color of iron, and the broken towers rose at intervals like the stumps of enormous teeth. There was no wind. There was no sound except the sound of his boots on the hard ground, and somewhere far ahead, a low-frequency hum that might have been machinery, or might have been nothing at all. He was on his 5th day. He had 3 left. He walked. The first thing he saw that didn't belong was the light. Not sunlight, something sharper and more deliberate, a cone of blue-white brightness coming from the base of one of the fallen towers. And in that light there was movement. He stopped. He crouched in the dead grass and watched. And what he saw made him go very still in the way of an animal that knows it has been noticed by something large. It was not human. It was never going to be human. That much was clear from first look. The thing that moved in the beam of light was tall and multi-jointed, and it moved with the specific wrongness of something that had evolved in gravity very different from this. It was cataloging. That was the only word for what it was doing. Moving through the ruins with instruments Soren couldn't name, taking measurements, logging information into a device that pulsed with each entry. Its skin, if that was the word, was the color of tarnished copper, and it had two sets of eyes, and both sets were angled downward, focused on its work, and it had not yet seen him. Soren counted to 3, then he moved. He went wide around the tower, keeping low, keeping the dead grass between himself and the light. He had 3 days. He didn't have time for whatever this was. He cleared the perimeter of the light cone and picked up speed, and the hum behind him changed, pitched slightly, which might have meant nothing, and might have meant everything. And he didn't look back. He didn't look back for a long time. The dead fields gave way to something stranger around mid-morning. The ground here had a different quality. Not soil exactly, more like the surface had been smoothed, engineered, laid down by intention rather than geology. The broken towers were more densely spaced, and between them Soren could see the remnants of structures that had been larger once, much larger. Walls that curved in ways that suggested domes, archways that framed nothing now, staircases that stopped 10 meters up in empty air. He recognized none of it from the map. He stopped and unfolded the cloth and looked at it a long time. The map showed the valley. It showed the cave, and it showed the far ridge where the door was supposed to be. And between the two, it showed 3 symbols that the elders had described as trials, without being able to say what the trials actually were. The symbols were geometric, a circle, a grid, a closed hand. He looked up at the ruins around him. He looked at the first symbol. Then he walked toward the largest of the curved walls. The beast was inside. He smelled it before he saw it. A deep animal reek, something organic and massive. And then he turned the corner of the curved wall, and there it was, filling the interior of what must have once been a great chamber, a creature of such overwhelming physical scale that his mind simply refused to process it for a moment and gave him instead a kind of visual static. Limbs, hide the sound of breathing like a slow bellows. It was chained. He saw that after a moment the heavy links embedded in the floor at 4 points. But the chains were old and the floor around them was cracked, and he gave the chains maybe 2 or 3 cycles of that slow breathing before they let go entirely. He thought about the puzzle with the weighted sphere. He thought about how the sphere always wanted to fall to the left, not to the right, and how the solution was never to fight that but to use it, to let the left pole carry the sphere through the section of the maze that curved right because the vectors canceled. And for one moment, the sphere was in a state of perfect equilibrium. And that was the moment you moved it forward. He found the mechanism on the west wall. It was old and corroded, but the shape of it was familiar. A variation on the sliding lock, the same logic, the same sequence of moves that open the latch on a slightly different configuration. His hands found it before his conscious mind did. He moved it left, then down, then left again, and the beast's chains didn't release. Instead, the floor beneath it tilted 4 degrees east, and the creature, confused, shifted its weight. And in that shift, Soren was already through the gap in the far wall and moving. Behind him, the beast settled. The chains held. He heard it make a sound, low, mournful, almost familiar, and then the ruins swallowed the sound and he was back in the open air. He sat down against a broken wall and drank from the water skin and let his hands shake for a moment. They had earned that. He gave them 30 seconds, and then he made them stop and he stood up and went on. The second trial was different in kind. The grid symbol on the map led him to a plateau, and on the plateau there was a structure that had clearly been maintained, cleaned, preserved, the dust around it deliberately disturbed by something that visited it regularly. The structure was low and circular, about 30 meters across, and its surface was covered in an array of interlocking geometric shapes. Triangles, hexagons, a few forms he had no name for, all of them slightly recessed into the surface at varying depths. He was standing at the edge of it when the creature arrived. It was smaller than the beast in the ruins, about twice his height, bipedal, covered in that same tarnished copper skin. Not the same creature he'd seen at the fallen tower. Similar, related maybe. This one had instruments too, hanging from a harness across its torso, and it moved with a kind of focused economy that Soren recognized because he had it himself. It stopped when it saw him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Soren stood at the edge of the game board, which was clearly what it was, and the creature stood 10 meters away with its double set of eyes focused on him and its instruments absolutely still in its hands. Then, with a deliberateness that could not have been anything except intentional, it stepped to the far edge of the board and placed one of its instruments, a small triangular object, in one of the recessed hexagons. It looked at him. Soren looked at the board. He had never played this exact game. He had played 37 other variants of geometric logic games since he could move his fingers, and this board was a variant of something he'd worked in abstract on the puzzles the elders gave him. A three-dimensional strategic exercise that he'd solved as a two-dimensional problem by ignoring the depth component entirely. He walked onto the board. He reached down and moved one of the triangular shapes 3 positions diagonally. The creature went still in a way that was different from its previous stillness. Then it moved. They played for 2 hours. The sun moved overhead gray and unhurried. Somewhere in the second hour, Soren realized he was cold and made himself forget about it. The creature played with a kind of machine precision. Each move exactly calculated, no hesitation, no revision. And Soren played the way he'd always played the Elder's puzzles, which was to let the board tell him what it wanted, and then do something unexpected with the information. Not faster. Just sideways, consistently sideways, always one lateral shift beyond where the logic said the next move should land. He won. He knew he'd won about 6 moves before the end, and the creature seemed to know it around the same time, and continued playing anyway with that same precise economy, executing its losing moves with the some care it had brought to the opening. When it was done, the creature looked at him. He couldn't read the expression, didn't know if there was one, but the double set of eyes moved over him in a way that felt like assessment rather than threat. Then it stepped off the board and walked away. Soren stayed where he was for a moment. Then he picked up the triangular piece he'd used for his final move. He didn't know why, just that it felt like the right thing to do, and put it in his pocket and walked on. He was deep into the 6th day now. His legs knew it, his shoulders knew it. He had enough water for another half day, and the map said the 3rd trial was close, but maps were suggestions. And this map was a very old suggestion, and he was trying not to think about the arithmetic of time remaining versus distance to the door. The 3rd trial found him before he found it. He had stopped at the edge of a dry riverbed to eat the last of the compressed food Marin had pressed into his hands at the cave mouth, and he was watching the far bank, calculating the drop, when the ground shifted. Not dramatically, a tremor, the kind the valley got sometimes, the kind that started deep and moved up through the stone. But this one didn't stop. It built. The dry riverbed cracked along a seam he hadn't noticed, and from the crack came a sound like the one he'd heard on the plateau, low, regular, mechanical. The wall of stone on the far bank was not, it turned out, a wall of stone. It was a door. The largest thing he had ever seen that was made rather than grown, taller than the towers, taller than anything in the valley, gray-black in the gray light, and absolutely massive. And it was coming open. Not fully open, not yet. A crack. A seam of different colored light from whatever was behind it. And on his side of the riverbed, stepping out of the tremor, like the tremor was something they had caused, were 6 of the copper-skinned creatures, all armed with instruments he hadn't seen before, instruments with directional weight, instruments that tracked him in a way that felt precise and impersonal, and very much like threat. Soren stood up slowly. He put away the cloth wrapping from the food. He looked at the 6 creatures in front of him, and then at the crack in the enormous door behind them, and he thought about the sphere in the maze, the way it always wanted to fall left, and how the solution was never to fight what the thing wanted. He thought about the closed hand on the map, the 3rd symbol. He held up his palm, the line Marin had read. The creatures didn't move. He kept the palm up. He met the double set of eyes on the nearest one. He stood there in the cold gray light with his legs aching and his water almost gone, and 1 day left, and he didn't move and he didn't flinch. And he looked at them with nothing on his face except the plain fact of himself. Something changed. He felt it before he saw it, a shift in the quality of the air around the creatures, a change in the way they stood, something in their posture that was different from how they'd been 2 seconds before. The nearest one lowered its instrument, then the one beside it, then the ones behind in sequence, a slow, deliberate uncocking like a row of held breaths all released at once. The nearest creature turned and moved to the enormous door. It placed its hands, 4-fingered, precise, on the door's surface, and it worked a mechanism that Soren could hear but couldn't see, and the door moved. It moved like something that had been still for a very long time, and had finally been given permission to be different. The light that came through was nothing like the pale gray of the valley. It was full and warm, and it moved, the way light moves when there's nothing filtering it, and it crossed the dry riverbed and reached Soren, and he stood in it, and it felt like the word he had seen painted on the cave walls, the word the elders had used for something that had once existed here before everything got compressed into 8 days. The word was morning. He walked through the door. What was on the other side did not fit inside any framework he had. He did not try to make it fit. He stood and looked. A plain, vast and flat, lit by a sun he had never seen in its full working capacity, and on the plain technology. Intact technology, machines that hummed and pulsed and processed, and structures that had not fallen, and between the structures, people. Not the copper-skinned creatures, people, human people. Dozens of them, maybe more, and they were moving with the ordinary purpose of ordinary lives. And none of them moved with the compressed urgency of someone trying to finish living in 8 days. One of them saw him, an older man, gray-haired, who stopped and looked at Soren standing in the open door with the gray valley behind him and the light ahead of him. And the older man's face did something complicated that took a moment to resolve into its component parts. There was recognition in it. Not personal recognition. He didn't know Soren, they'd never met, but a different kind, the recognition of a pattern long expected, finally arrived. He walked to Soren and stopped. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the boy's face, at his exhausted legs, at the worn thin blade, and the empty water skin and the triangular game piece in his hand. "How long?" the man said. Soren knew what he was asking. "I have until tomorrow." The man nodded slowly. He put out his hand, the plain gesture, ancient, nothing of ceremony in it, and Soren took it. "Then let me show you what you came here to do," the man said. "We don't have time to do it slowly, so I'm going to tell you the important parts, and you're going to have to trust that the rest will follow." All right. The mechanism under the valley is still intact. It was never broken, it was locked. There's a sequence to unlock it, 5 steps. Your people have been practicing the 5 steps for generations without knowing that's what they were doing. Soren looked at his hands. The sliding lock, the weighted sphere, the 3-dimensional board. He looked up. "The puzzles," he said. "Yes." "The training." "Yes." He stood there with the warm light on him and felt the weight of all of it. The generations of elders with click tablets and their lost knowledge. The children strapped to their learning boards before they could walk. The line on his palm that had been read every generation and never found sufficient. All the Sorens that had come before him and walked this far and not quite made it. He felt all of it, and he took a breath and set it down. You couldn't carry that. You had to put it down and move. "Show me," he said. The mechanism was below the plane, accessible through a shaft that the man led him to, with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. It was clean and functioning and enormous, and it was laid out in a logic he knew immediately, the same logic that underlay all the games the elders had taught him, the same patterns at a different scale. The man stood beside him and talked him through the sequence, and Soren listened with the part of his mind that had been shaped by 5 days of training and recognized each step the way you recognize a face you've seen in a dream. He worked without stopping. He didn't think about the arithmetic of time remaining. He thought about the mechanism. He thought about the weighted sphere in the maze and the way it wanted to fall left, and the way you didn't fight that. Just used it. Just let the natural tendency of the thing carry it through the hard section. The first step took 20 minutes. His hands were sure. The second step took 40 minutes. He found a node that had seized and worked it loose with the blade, and it released with a sound like something sighing. The third step he did in 15 minutes because it was the sliding lock in a new configuration, and he had been solving the sliding lock since before he had words. The fourth step was the board game. Not the same pieces, but the same logic. The same 3-dimensional spatial problem he'd worked in 2 dimensions by ignoring depth. And the man watched him solve it in 8 minutes and said nothing, just watched. With that same complicated expression. The 5th step was something he had never seen before. He stood in front of it and looked at it for a long time. The man didn't speak. The mechanism waited. Soren thought about Maren, putting her hands on his face in the gray pre-dawn, and telling him the trials would be exactly what he'd trained for, even if they didn't look like it. He thought about the triangular game piece in his pocket, the one he'd picked up off the board without knowing why. He took it out and looked at it. There was a recess in the mechanism that was exactly the shape of the piece. He put it in. The mechanism made a sound that built from low to high over about 10 seconds, the sound of something vast returning to what it had always been supposed to be, and then the ground moved. Not a tremor, a settling, a correction. Something underground and enormous shifting into a position it had been built for, and through the shaft above them Soren could feel the change in the air. He came up the shaft and out onto the plain, and the sky was different. He couldn't have explained precisely how. The same sun, the same blue-gray distance, but the quality of the light had changed, had gotten more solid and deliberate, and when Haiti turned and looked back through the great door at the valley he had walked from, the gray there was lighter. Not gone, not yet, but different, beginning to be different. The pale sun over the valley was finding a new angle. The man stood beside him and looked at the same thing. "How long?" Soren asked. "Before they notice." "A day," the man said. "Maybe two. The mechanism has to calibrate, but it won't stop. It's been waiting a long time to not stop." Soren sat down on the ground. His legs had decided that was going to happen, and he saw no reason to argue with them. He sat in the warm light on the plain outside the great door and looked at the valley below and thought about the cave, and the elders and the children strapped to their learning boards, and the generations of people who had lived there 8 days and never seen this. He thought about Maren and the tremor in her hands on the 7th day. He took out the water skin and tilted it, and got approximately 3 drops, which he drank. He thought about rain. He thought about the paintings on the cave walls, the pigment lines that meant water falling from the sky, which he had seen described but never experienced. And he thought that if the mechanism did what the man said it would do, then the children being born today in the cave would grow up to an age where they might see rain. Real rain. Not a description of rain. That felt like enough. It didn't feel like enough. It felt like something larger than enough. A word he didn't have yet. A word that would need a longer life to acquire. He sat with the warm light on his face and let himself not have the word yet, and be all right with that. The man came and sat beside him. They sat in silence for a while. The kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that's full of things that don't need to be said yet, that can wait, that will still be there when the right words arrive. "We've been sending people through trials for a long time," the man said eventually. "Trying to find the one who had all the pieces." He paused. "You had all the pieces?" Soren looked at his hands. Ordinary hands, slightly calloused from the puzzles. Not anything special about them except the line. "They all did," he said. "Everyone that came before, they trained the same. They had the same pieces, they just..." He stopped. "They ran out of time," the man said. "Yes." The man was quiet for a moment. "Is that..." "No," Soren said. "It isn't." He said it, with the flat certainty of someone who had thought about this, and arrived somewhere settled. "They got further than the one before. They understood more. Each one that came got the line read and walked out and did what they could with the time they had. That's not failure. That's just how you get here. That's the path." The man looked at him. "How old are you?" the man said. It wasn't exactly a question. 6 days, Soren said. The man looked away. He looked at the valley, at the lightning gray, at the thin new quality of the sunlight moving across the dead fields. "When the mechanism finishes calibrating," he said carefully, "when the field that's compressing your cellular regeneration is neutralized, it will apply to everyone present. Not just those in the valley, everyone." Soren turned and looked at him. "You've been out here longer than 6 days, the man said. It took a moment for the arithmetic to complete. When it did, Soren sat with it. He let it be true, and then he let it be true again, and the second time it felt real. "How much longer?" he said. "I don't know exactly. Enough." The man met his eyes. "You'll know you're past your 8th day when you wake up on what should be your 9th. Soren looked at the valley, at the light changing over it, at the cave mouth, barely visible at this distance, a small dark opening in the cliff face. Maren would be there at the entrance right now, sitting in the gray pre-dawn the way she always did, waiting for news that either never came or came too late. He thought about what it would mean to wake up on a 9th day. He thought about rain. He thought about a word he didn't have yet, a word for the thing you felt when the future opened up in front of you and turned out to be real. And not just a painting on a wall, not just a story told to keep people walking forward. The thing you felt when you found out the story was true. He sat in the warm light with that word forming somewhere behind his sternum, taking shape in the dark the way all the most important things do, quietly, without announcement, arriving whole. Below, in the valley, in a cave where children were strapped to boards before they could walk, and elders wrote in scripts they could no longer fully read, and the 8 days ran their course generation after generation. with the grim patience of something waiting to be solved. Below in the valley, the quality of the light was changing. Nothing moved loudly, nothing announced itself. The mechanism turned, the sun found a new angle, and somewhere in the gray fields at the valley's edge, in the soil that had been the color of iron for as long as anyone could remember, something that had been dormant for a very long time felt the change in the light and began, without drama, to think about growing. There was a woman named Cass who had been assigned to the valley for 11 months, which in her experience was about 10 months. Too long for a planet with no weather worth describing. She was a xenogeological surveyor for the Meridian Consortium, and her job was to map the subsurface mineral deposits under the valley floor, and she did this job with professional competence and no particular enthusiasm, which was exactly how she did every job the Consortium assigned her. She had not expected to encounter people. That was the thing about the briefings. The Consortium's briefings were thorough on geology and entirely silent on anything the geology might be sitting under. She had been on planet for 3 weeks before she found the cave network. She had been mapping the cave network for another 2 weeks before she understood that it was inhabited. And she had been processing that understanding for approximately 4 days when the boy walked past her survey equipment in the pre-dawn gray with a water skin and a worn blade and a piece of folded cloth, heading toward the far end of the valley. And she had done something she almost never did, which was stop what she was doing and watch someone else. She watched until he was small in the distance, and then she went back to her instruments, and she filed the observation in the part of her mind where she filed things she planned to think about later. She was thinking about it now, sitting outside her survey tent at the edge of the dead fields. Because something had changed in the valley overnight and she was trying to figure out what. The instruments were no help. They measured rock and mineral and said nothing about quality of light. But she had been a surveyor long enough to trust her eyes when her eyes said something was different. And her eyes said the gray here was a shade lighter than it had been yesterday. She pulled out her atmospheric reader and took a reading. Then she took another one because the first reading had to be wrong. It wasn't wrong. The field readings were changing. The specific electromagnetic suppression that the Consortium's preliminary survey had categorized as a naturally occurring geological phenomenon. The field that she had been mapping around for 11 months, the one that sat over this valley like a lid on a jar, was weakening, not collapsing, changing, as if something was adjusting it from the inside. Cass sat with that information for a moment. Then she opened her comm unit and called in. "This is Cass, Survey Team 7, coordinates Delta 9. I need to report a significant field change. Possibly natural, possibly not." She paused. "Also, I found people." There was a long silence on the comm. "Surveyor Cass," said the voice of whoever was on duty back at Relay Station. "Please clarify. Did you say people?" "Approximately 60 individuals," she said. "Cave dwellings in the North Cliff face. They appear to have been here a long time." Another pause. She was watching the far end of the valley, where the great door was. "One of them just changed everything, I think." She sat in the lightning gray and watched the quality of the morning change, and she thought about the boy with the worn blade walking into the dead fields before dawn. And she thought about the Consortium's briefings, and how thoroughly they had failed to prepare her for any of this, and she thought, with the particular clarity of someone who has just seen something they will spend the rest of their career trying to understand, that she was going to need a much longer assignment. The atmospheric reader beeped softly. Another data point. The field was still changing. The lid on the jar, moving. Above the North Cliff, at the cave mouth she had been mapping around for 11 months, she could see small figures moving into the light. The consortium arrived in force on the 14th day after Soren opened the door. They always arrived in force. It was an organizational habit that had outlasted any strategic logic for it, the bureaucratic equivalent of a reflex. 7 ships, 4 survey teams, 3 administrative personnel, and a xenobiological assessment unit that had been dispatched from the regional hub at a speed suggesting someone in authority had finally read Cass's filed reports and understood that she had not been exaggerating. She met them at the landing site with the calm of someone who had already processed the surprise and come out the other side. She had been on planet for 12 months now. She had watched the gray lift. She had watched the cave community's first tentative movement out of the cliff face and into the new quality of light, the careful exploratory steps of people testing ground that had been forbidden to them not by rule, but by the simple daily calculus of survival.
Watch them look at the sky.
when the electromagnetic field weakened enough to change the way the atmosphere handled moisture. And she had watched what happened when the first overcast rolled in from the western ridge and broke. Rain. She had watched 60 people experience rain for the first time, and she had written a report about it that was 13 pages long and contained, somewhere around page 9, the admission that she had cried, which she had included because she was a scientist, and a scientist noted the relevant data. The consortium people came out of the ships with their instruments and their assessing expressions, and they looked at the valley, which was green in patches now. Small, tentative patches, more suggestion than fact, but definitely green. And they looked at the cave community, which had sent a delegation of 3 people to the landing site. And the 3 people stood there in the thin new sunlight, with the patience of people who had learned patience from necessity, and the consortium people looked at their instruments and then at each other. "They've been here how long?" the senior administrator asked Cass. "Generations," she said. "We're not certain how many. Their oral history compresses. They don't have a traditional recording time beyond the 8-day span, because until recently that was all the time there was." "Until recently," the administrator repeated. "Yes, one individual opened a subsurface mechanism, yes, in 8 days. In 6, actually. He started on day 5. She paused. "He's still here, if you want to talk to him." She watched the administrator process this. She watched the careful bureaucratic calculus happening behind his eyes, the protocols, the assessment frameworks, the 17 forms that would need to be filed, the extraordinary circumstances exceptions that would need to be invoked. She watched him look at the 3 delegation members standing in the new sunlight and arrive somewhere she hadn't expected him to arrive. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'd like to talk to him." Soren was at the door when they found him. He was there, most mornings now, standing at the threshold with the warm light behind him and the valley ahead, watching the green patches, checking the quality of the light with the same careful attention the elders had trained into him for purposes that had turned out to be exactly what they appeared to be. He had woken up on his 9th day with the specific uncanny feeling of crossing a border he'd thought was a wall. And on his 10th day, the feeling had become something quieter and more settled. The feeling of continued existence as a fact, rather than a surprise. He was still getting used to it. The administrator was a man named Paulus, gray-haired and careful, and he had the look of someone who had spent a career processing extraordinary things through ordinary frameworks and had finally run out of ordinary frameworks. He came to the door and stopped and looked at it, the sheer scale of it, the age, the sense of it as a thing built by serious people for a serious purpose, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Soren. "I've read the surveyor's reports," he said. "I've read about the mechanism, the training your people passed down, the trials." He stopped. "I need to understand something." "All right, when you went into the trials, when you faced the creatures, the game, the mechanism, you didn't know, not for certain, that it would work, that it would be enough." Soren looked at the valley, at the green patches, at the caves visible in the cliff face, tiny at this distance, the dark openings that had held his people for more generations than anyone could accurately count. "No," he said. "Not for certain, but you kept going. Everyone kept going," Soren said. He said it the way he'd said it to the man on the plane, with the flat certainty of someone who had arrived somewhere settled and was not going to be moved from it. "Everyone before me walked out and did what they could with the time they had. They got further than the one before. They understood more. I just happened to be the one with all the pieces already in my pocket." He paused. "I almost left the game piece behind, the one for the 5th step. I picked it up because it felt right, that's all. If I hadn't, but you did," Paulus said. "Yes." Paulus was quiet. He looked at the door. He looked at the valley beyond, at the new light, at the small figures moving at the cliff base, in a way that was already different from how they'd moved 6 weeks ago. Less urgent, less compressed. People beginning to move like people who had somewhere to be, but didn't have to be there in the next 8 days or not at all. "What do you need?" Paulus said. Soren looked at him. He had expected more forms, more assessment, more of the careful bureaucratic processing he'd watched the administrator doing at the landing site. He hadn't expected the question to be that direct. He thought about it. "Soil amendments," he said. "Whatever makes things grow. The fields have been dead a long time, and they don't know how to start. Whatever helps a thing start again, we need that." He thought some more. "Medical. Our people age in 8 days, and then they don't anymore, and none of us know what that means for the bodies. What happens to a body that was built to age fast and then suddenly isn't? We need someone who knows. Paulus was writing. And time, Soren said. Just time. To figure out what we're supposed to be now. What a life is when you have more of it than you can hold in your two hands. He paused. We've been training for this our whole history, and we don't have a tradition for what comes after the training. Paulus stopped writing. He looked at Soren. Nobody does, he said. That part you figure out as you go. Soren nodded. That was, it turned out, all right. He was good at figuring things out as he went. He had been trained for it, after all, by people who had understood its importance, even after they'd forgotten exactly why. He turned back to the door. He looked through it at the plane, and the machinery and the full sun, doing its full work. Then he looked back at the valley, at the pale new green in the dead fields, at the caves in the cliff face, at the small figures moving in the new morning light. He had a 9th day, he had a 10th. He had whatever came after that. All the days that had been compressed into 8 suddenly spread out ahead of him, like a field that didn't know yet what it wanted to grow, but had the time now to decide. That was enough. That was everything. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the triangular game piece there, smooth and cool, and he stood in the doorway between the old world and the new one, and watched the morning happen over the valley. And it was exactly as good as the painting on the wall had always promised it would be.